The scorching heat of the Pacific sun beat down mercilessly on the makeshift prisoner-of-war camp, where rows of hastily constructed barracks stretched across the dusty compound like scars on the earth. It was August 1945, and the war that had consumed the world for years was finally drawing to its bloody conclusion. Behind the razor wire and wooden watchtowers, a scene was about to unfold that would challenge everything 19-year-old Private Jimmy Morrison thought he knew about his enemies. Jimmy stood at his post, rifle slung across his shoulder, watching as the daily meal distribution began. The American guards moved with casual efficiency, ladling out portions of rice, canned meat, and vegetables to the silent line of Japanese prisoners. But today was different. Today, the mess sergeant had decided to add something special to the menu: vanilla ice cream, shipped in from the States and carefully preserved in the camp's new refrigeration unit. The first prisoner approached the serving line, a middle-aged man with graying hair and deep lines etched around his eyes. When the mess cook placed a small bowl of the pale, creamy substance beside his regular ration, the man stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened with what Jimmy could only describe as terror. The prisoner stared at the ice cream as if it was some kind of explosive device, then looked up at the American soldiers with genuine confusion and fear. Jimmy had grown up in Kansas, where summer afternoons meant trips to Miller's ice cream parlor on Main Street. The sweet, cold treat was as American as apple pie, as normal as breathing. But as he watched prisoner after prisoner react with the same mixture of bewilderment and suspicion, Jimmy began to realize he was witnessing something extraordinary. These men, these soldiers who had fought with legendary ferocity across the Pacific, had never seen ice cream in their lives. The young private found himself studying the faces of the prisoners more intently than ever before. There was Hiroshi Tanaka, barely 20 years old, who Jimmy had noticed because of his obvious intelligence and the way other prisoners seemed to defer to him, despite his youth. Hiroshi's reaction to the ice cream was particularly striking. He examined it with the careful attention of a scientist encountering an unknown substance, his brow furrowed in concentration. Most of the prisoners simply refused the dessert entirely, pushing the bowls away with polite but firm gestures. Others accepted them but left them untouched, allowing the ice cream to melt into sweet white puddles in the sweltering heat. The waste bothered Jimmy more than he expected. Back home, ice cream was a luxury during wartime rationing. Here, it was being treated like poison. The other American guards found the situation amusing. "Look at 'em," laughed Corporal Peterson, a heavy-set man from Detroit. "Act like we're trying to poison them or something. Ungrateful, if you ask me." But Jimmy didn't find it funny. Something about the genuine fear and confusion in the prisoner's eyes struck him as profoundly sad rather than entertaining. As the distribution continued, Jimmy noticed the rigid hierarchy among the prisoners. The older men ate first, followed by those of middle rank, and finally the youngest soldiers. They shared their meager rations with mathematical precision, ensuring that everyone received exactly their fair portion. It was a level of discipline and mutual care that Jimmy had rarely seen, even among his own fellow soldiers. The afternoon wore on, and Jimmy couldn't shake the image of those untouched bowls of melted ice cream. He began to wonder about these men, who they had been before the war, what their lives were like back in Japan, whether they had families waiting for them. The propaganda posters back home had painted them as inhuman monsters, but watching them now, Jimmy saw only tired, hungry men far from home. That evening, as Jimmy sat in his bunk writing a letter to his mother back in Topeka, he found himself struggling to describe what he had witnessed. How could he explain to her that something as simple and innocent as ice cream had revealed such a vast cultural divide? How could he make her understand that these prisoners, these supposed enemies, seemed just as human and vulnerable as anyone else? The memory of his older brother Tom haunted these quiet moments. Tom had died at Iwo Jima 6 months earlier, cut down by Japanese machine gun fire while storming a beach that looked nothing like the wheat fields of Kansas where they had grown up together. Jimmy had enlisted partly out of grief, partly out of rage, and partly out of a desire to honor his brother's sacrifice. But now, face to face with actual Japanese soldiers, that rage was becoming something more complicated. Jimmy remembered the ice cream socials at their local church, where Tom would always order 2 scoops of strawberry, while Jimmy preferred chocolate. He remembered their father teaching them to make homemade ice cream with rock salt and an old hand-crank freezer, the way the whole family would take turns churning until their arms ached. These were the memories that defined summer in America, the simple pleasures that made life worth living. But these Japanese prisoners had no such memories. They came from a world where ice cream didn't exist, where such luxuries were unimaginable. Jimmy began to understand that the fear in their eyes wasn't just about the unfamiliar food, it was about everything it represented. The vast technological and cultural gap between their worlds, the alien nature of American abundance, the uncertainty about whether this strange offering was kindness or cruelty. The next morning brought the same routine, but Jimmy found himself paying closer attention to the interactions between guards and prisoners. The language barrier was absolute. Most of the Americans spoke no Japanese, and few of the prisoners knew more than a handful of English words. Communication happened through gestures, pointing, and the occasional drawing in the dirt. It was a primitive system that left enormous room for misunderstanding. Jimmy watched as Hiroshi helped an older prisoner who was struggling with weakness from the heat. The young man's gentleness and respect toward his elder reminded Jimmy of how he had cared for his own grandfather during his final illness. These small acts of humanity were becoming impossible to ignore, creating cracks in the wall of hatred that the war had built around Jimmy's heart. The camp itself was a study in contrasts. The American section, where the guards lived, was relatively comfortable with electric fans, cold drinks, and regular mail from home. The prisoner section was Spartanly functional, basic shelter, adequate food, and medical care that met the minimum requirements of international law. But there was no comfort, no luxury, no acknowledgement that these men were anything more than defeated enemies, to be contained until the war's end. As Jimmy walked his patrol route that afternoon, he noticed details he had previously overlooked, the way the prisoners maintained their small living spaces with meticulous care, despite having almost no personal possessions. The quiet dignity with which they endured the heat, the boredom, and the uncertainty of their fate. The subtle ways they looked out for each other, sharing resources and providing emotional support without drawing attention from the guards. The ice cream incident had opened Jimmy's eyes to something profound. These men weren't the faceless monsters of wartime propaganda. They were individuals with their own stories, their own losses, their own hopes for survival and eventual return home. The realization was both humanizing and deeply troubling because it forced Jimmy to confront the complexity of a war he had previously seen in simple terms of good versus evil. That night, as the tropical sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jimmy found himself wondering what would happen when the war finally ended. Would these prisoners return to Japan as heroes or as failures? Would they be able to rebuild their lives, or would they be forever marked by their defeat and captivity? And what about himself? How would he return to the simple life of small-town Kansas after witnessing the profound human cost of global conflict? The questions multiplied in his mind as he prepared for another night of guard duty, another day of watching over men who were simultaneously his enemies and his fellow human beings. The morning sun cast long shadows across the compound as Jimmy began his shift, but something felt different. Word had spread through the American ranks that a new commanding officer was arriving. Colonel Harrison, a man with a reputation for strict discipline and zero tolerance for what he called fraternization with the enemy. The relaxed atmosphere that had allowed small gestures of humanity was about to change dramatically. Jimmy had spent the night thinking about the ice cream incident, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to understand these prisoners better. Against regulations, he had started observing them more closely during his patrols, noting their routines, their interactions, their quiet dignity in the face of defeat. What he saw challenged everything he had been taught about the Japanese character. Hiroshi Tanaka had become a particular focus of Jimmy's attention. The young prisoner carried himself with an intelligence and composure that reminded Jimmy of his college-bound friends back home. During work details, Hiroshi often helped translate between the guards and other prisoners, demonstrating a basic understanding of English that he had kept hidden until necessity demanded its use. There was something in his eyes, a depth of thought and feeling that spoke of education, culture, and dreams that had been interrupted by war. The arrival of Colonel Harrison changed everything overnight. The new commander called an immediate assembly of all American personnel, his steel-gray eyes scanning the ranks with military precision. His message was clear and uncompromising. The prisoners were enemy combatants who deserved nothing beyond the minimum required by international law. Any guard caught showing unnecessary kindness or engaging in unauthorized communication would face court-martial. The colonel's first order was to eliminate all luxury items from prisoner meals. The ice cream experiment was over before it had truly begun. But more than that, Harrison implemented a series of new restrictions designed to maintain absolute separation between captors and captives. Guards were forbidden from making eye contact with prisoners except when necessary for security. Conversations, even those required for work supervision, were to be conducted through interpreters only. Jimmy felt the weight of these new rules like a physical burden. The small connections he'd begun to feel with the prisoners, the shared humanity he had glimpsed in their reactions to simple kindness, were now explicitly forbidden. But the restrictions only intensified his curiosity about these men and their world. During his off-duty hours, Jimmy found himself thinking about Hiroshi's background. What had his life been like before the war? Had he attended university? Did he have family waiting for him in Japan? The questions burned in Jimmy's mind, but the new regulations made any attempt to find answers dangerous to his military career. The prisoners, for their part, seemed to sense the change in atmosphere immediately. Their already rigid discipline became even more pronounced, and the small gestures of acknowledgement that had occasionally passed between guards and prisoners disappeared entirely. The compound felt colder despite the tropical heat, charged with a tension that made everyone uncomfortable. It was during this period of increased restrictions that Jimmy made a decision that would change everything. He had been thinking about the ice cream incident for days, replaying the genuine wonder and confusion he had seen in the prisoners' faces. The idea that something so fundamental to his own childhood experience was completely alien to theirs had opened a window into the vast cultural divide between their worlds. One evening, as Jimmy prepared for night duty, he made a choice that defied every regulation Colonel Harrison had established. He was going to bridge that divide, one small gesture at a time. The plan that formed in his mind was simple but dangerous. He would find a way to share not just ice cream, but the experience of ice cream with these men who had never known such simple pleasures. The opportunity came 3 days later, during the evening meal distribution. Jimmy had volunteered for kitchen duty, knowing it would give him access to the camp's small supply of ice cream ingredients. Working quickly and quietly, he prepared a small batch of vanilla ice cream using the hand-crank freezer in the mess hall. The familiar rhythm of churning brought back memories of summer afternoons with his brother Tom. But now, those memories carried a different weight. As the prisoners lined up for their evening meal, Jimmy positioned himself near the serving area with a small bowl of freshly made ice cream. His heart pounded as he approached the line where Hiroshi stood waiting. The young Japanese man looked up with surprise as Jimmy stepped forward, breaking every protocol Colonel Harrison had established. Jimmy held out the bowl, his hands trembling slightly with nervousness and determination. For a moment, the two young men simply looked at each other across the vast divide of language, culture, and war. Then Jimmy did something that transcended all barriers. He took a spoonful of the ice cream himself, smiling as the cold sweetness hit his tongue, demonstrating that this strange white substance was not only safe, but delicious. Hiroshi's eyes widened with understanding. Slowly, carefully, he accepted the bowl and took a tentative taste. The transformation that crossed his face was immediate and profound. Surprise gave way to wonder, wonder to delight, and delight to something approaching joy. It was the first genuine smile Jimmy had seen from any of the prisoners since his arrival at the camp. The moment stretched between them, a bridge of shared human experience spanning the chasm of war. Other prisoners began to notice, their attention drawn by Hiroshi's unexpected reaction. Word spread quickly through the line in hushed Japanese whispers, and soon dozens of eyes were focused on this unprecedented exchange between captor and captive. Jimmy found himself caught up in the moment, forgetting the risks and regulations, as he watched these battle-hardened soldiers experience something as innocent and joyful as ice cream for the first time. Some approached with curiosity, others with suspicion, but all with a hunger that went beyond mere physical nourishment, a hunger for kindness, for normalcy, for some small reminder that the world contained beauty as well as brutality. The spell was broken by the sharp bark of Colonel Harrison's voice, cutting through the evening air. The commanding officer had appeared as if from nowhere, his face dark with fury as he took in the scene before him. Jimmy felt his blood turn to ice as he realized the magnitude of his transgression. He had not only violated direct orders, but had done so in full view of dozens of witnesses. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Colonel Harrison's voice carried across the compound as he dressed down the young private, his words sharp enough to cut steel. Jimmy stood at attention, accepting the verbal assault while his mind raced with the implications of his actions. Court-martial seemed inevitable, and with it the end of his military career and possibly his freedom. But something unexpected happened as the colonel's tirade continued. Hiroshi stepped forward, his movement deliberate and unmistakably protective. In halting but clear English, he addressed the commanding officer directly, his words carefully chosen and respectfully delivered. He explained that the American soldier had shown kindness, that no harm had been done, that the gesture had been one of simple human decency. The other prisoners watched in stunned silence as their informal leader risked punishment to defend an American guard. It was a moment that crystallized everything Jimmy had been feeling about the artificial barriers between them. Here was a man who had every reason to hate Americans, yet he was willing to speak up for one who had shown him a moment of kindness. Colonel Harrison's response was predictably harsh. Both Jimmy and Hiroshi were placed under immediate arrest, pending investigation and disciplinary action. As military police led Jimmy away, he caught one last glimpse of the Japanese prisoners standing in absolute silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of admiration for Hiroshi's courage and concern for the consequences of this unprecedented breach of protocol. The cell where Jimmy spent the next 3 days was small and stifling, but it gave him time to think about what had happened and what it meant. He had crossed a line that military discipline demanded remain inviolate, but he had also discovered something profound about the nature of humanity in wartime. The simple act of sharing ice cream had revealed that beneath the uniforms and nationalism, Beneath the hatred and fear, there remained a common core of human experience that no war could completely destroy. The military tribunal convened on a sweltering Tuesday morning, the kind of oppressive heat that made everyone irritable and short-tempered. Jimmy sat in the defendant's chair, his dress uniform crisp despite the humidity, facing a panel of 3 officers who would determine his fate. The charges were serious: violation of direct orders, unauthorized fraternization with enemy prisoners, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Any one of them could end his military career and land him in a federal prison. But as the proceedings began, something unexpected started to happen. The camp chaplain, Father McKenna, requested permission to testify on Jimmy's behalf. The elderly priest had been quietly observing the treatment of prisoners since his arrival at the camp, and his words carried weight with the tribunal. He spoke about the Geneva Conventions, about the moral obligations of civilized nations toward prisoners of war, and about the difference between military necessity and simple human decency. Meanwhile, in the prisoner compound, Hiroshi faced his own consequences. Colonel Harrison had ordered him placed in solitary confinement as punishment for his intervention, but the other Japanese prisoners had responded in a way that surprised everyone. They had organized what could only be described as a silent protest, refusing to participate in work details and maintaining absolute silence during all interactions with American guards. The protest was not defiant or aggressive. It was conducted with the same quiet dignity that characterized everything the prisoners did. They simply stopped cooperating beyond the absolute minimum required for survival. No work songs, no conversation, no acknowledgement of guard commands beyond basic compliance. The effect was eerie and profoundly unsettling to the American personnel. Jimmy learned about the protest from Father McKenna during a brief meeting before his tribunal hearing. The chaplain explained that the prisoner's action was unprecedented in the camp's history, and that it was clearly connected to Jimmy's arrest and Hiroshi's punishment. The young private felt a mixture of guilt and amazement, guilt that his actions had caused problems for the prisoners, and amazement that they would risk further punishment to show solidarity with an American guard. The tribunal heard testimony from multiple witnesses, including several guards who had observed the ice cream incident. Some testified that Jimmy's actions were clearly insubordinate and dangerous, potentially encouraging prisoner uprising or escape attempts. Others, however, spoke about the positive changes they had noticed in prisoner behavior following small acts of kindness, and questioned whether rigid adherence to protocol was always in the best interest of camp security. The most compelling testimony came from an unexpected source: Sergeant Williams, a veteran of the European theater who had experience with German prisoners of war. He told the tribunal about camps where humane treatment had actually improved security and cooperation, where prisoners who were treated with basic dignity became valuable sources of intelligence and caused fewer disciplinary problems. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that Jimmy's case had become a lightning rod for larger questions about prisoner treatment and military policy. The war was winding down, and questions about post-war relations with Japan were already being discussed at the highest levels of government. How America treated Japanese prisoners now would influence diplomatic relations for years to come. The tribunal recessed for deliberation, leaving Jimmy to wait in agonizing uncertainty. During this time, Father McKenna brought him news that changed everything. An inspection team from the International Red Cross was scheduled to visit the camp within the week, and there were rumors that they had already received reports about conditions and treatment of prisoners. The timing of Jimmy's case had suddenly become much more significant. The decision, when it came, was both surprising and carefully calculated. Jimmy was found guilty of violating direct orders, but received only a formal reprimand and reduction in rank. More importantly, Colonel Harrison was quietly reassigned to another posting, and the camp was placed under new command with explicit orders to implement what the military euphemistically called enhanced prisoner welfare protocols. The new commanding officer, Major Thompson, was a different kind of soldier entirely. A career officer with experience in military intelligence, he understood that the war's end was approaching and that America's treatment of prisoners would be scrutinized by the international community. His first order was to release Hiroshi from solitary confinement and to end the punitive measures that had been implemented against the prisoner population. But the damage to trust had been significant. The prisoners remained wary and withdrawn, their brief glimpse of American kindness having been followed by harsh punishment that confirmed their worst fears about their captors. The silent protest continued, even after Hiroshi's release, creating an atmosphere of tension that made everyone uncomfortable. It was Hiroshi himself who finally broke the impasse. During the first prisoner assembly under Major Thompson's command, he stood and addressed his fellow prisoners in rapid Japanese. Jimmy, watching from his guard position, could not understand the words but could see their effect. The rigid posture of the prisoners began to relax slightly, and some of the tension that had gripped the compound for days started to dissipate. Later, through the camp interpreter, Jimmy learned what Hiroshi had told his fellow prisoners. He had spoken about the difference between individual kindness and institutional policy, about the complexity of human nature even in wartime, and about the importance of maintaining hope for eventual understanding between their peoples. It was a message of remarkable wisdom and maturity from a young man who had every reason to embrace bitterness and hatred. Major Thompson, recognizing an opportunity to rebuild trust and improve camp conditions, announced the implementation of a new program that he called Cultural Exchange Initiatives. The program was carefully designed to provide educational and recreational opportunities for prisoners while maintaining security and discipline. It included English language classes, discussions about American culture and democratic principles, and limited recreational activities. The centerpiece of the new program was something that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier: regular social events where prisoners could interact with guards in a controlled, supervised environment. The first of these events was scheduled for the following week, and Major Thompson made it clear that participation was voluntary for both prisoners and guards. Jimmy volunteered immediately, despite the risks to his already damaged military record. He was determined to prove that his actions had been motivated by genuine desire for understanding rather than mere insubordination. More importantly, he wanted to continue the conversation that had begun with a simple bowl of ice cream. The announcement of the cultural exchange program created mixed reactions among both prisoners and guards. Some American soldiers remained skeptical, viewing any friendly interaction with former enemies as potentially dangerous or unpatriotic. Among the prisoners, there was similar division between those who saw opportunity for positive change and those who viewed any cooperation with their captors as betrayal of their military honor. Hiroshi found himself in a particularly difficult position as the informal leader of the prisoner group. His intervention on Jimmy's behalf had already marked him as someone willing to bridge cultural divides, but it had also raised questions among some prisoners about his loyalty and judgment. The decision about whether to participate in the cultural exchange program would be seen as a test of his leadership and his vision for how they should conduct themselves in captivity. The week leading up to the first cultural exchange event was filled with preparation and anxiety on both sides. Major Thompson worked with his staff to develop guidelines and security protocols that would allow meaningful interaction while preventing any security breaches. The prisoners held their own discussions, debating the wisdom and propriety of participating in what some viewed as American propaganda efforts. Jimmy spent his off-duty hours thinking about what he wanted to accomplish during these exchanges. The ice cream incident had opened his eyes to the vast cultural differences between American and Japanese experiences, but it had also revealed the universal human capacity for joy, wonder, and connection. He hoped that more structured opportunities for interaction might build on that foundation and create lasting understanding between former enemies. As the day of the first cultural exchange approached, the entire camp buzzed with nervous energy. Everyone understood that they were participating in an experiment that could either bridge the divide between two cultures or create new sources of conflict and misunderstanding. The stakes felt enormous, and the outcome was far from certain. The first cultural exchange event took place in the camp's mess hall on a humid Thursday evening, with tables arranged in a large circle to encourage conversation. Major Thompson had decided to start simple, an informal gathering where prisoners and guards could share stories about their home countries, their families, and their lives before the war. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful as about 20 prisoners and an equal number of American soldiers took their seats. Jimmy found himself sitting across from Hiroshi, the first time they had been able to face each other as equals since the ice cream incident. The young Japanese man looked different somehow, more relaxed, though still maintaining the dignified posture that seemed natural to him. When their eyes met, Hiroshi offered a slight nod of recognition that Jimmy returned with a cautious smile. The conversation began awkwardly, with Major Thompson serving as moderator and the camp interpreter working overtime to bridge the language gap. But gradually, as guards and prisoners began sharing simple stories about their hometowns, their families, and their peacetime occupations, the artificial barriers started to break down. Jimmy learned that Hiroshi had been a literature student at Tokyo Imperial University, studying American and British authors before the war interrupted his education. The revelation struck Jimmy like a physical blow. Here was a young man who had been reading Hemingway and Steinbeck while Jimmy was still struggling through high school English classes back in Kansas. Hiroshi's knowledge of American culture was far more sophisticated than Jimmy had imagined, and it became clear that his earlier intervention with Colonel Harrison had been delivered in carefully chosen English that reflected genuine understanding of American values and ideals. As the evening progressed, other surprising connections emerged. One of the prisoners had worked in his family's restaurant in Kyoto and was fascinated to learn about American cooking techniques from the camp's mess sergeant. Another had been an engineer who was eager to discuss the technological innovations he had observed in American equipment and machinery. These were not the fanatical warriors of propaganda posters. They were educated, curious men with interests and expertise that transcended national boundaries. The breakthrough moment came when Sergeant Rodriguez, a Mexican-American soldier from Texas, began describing his grandmother's method for making ice cream using rock salt and an old wooden churn. Hiroshi listened with intense concentration, asking detailed questions about the process through the interpreter. When Rodriguez mentioned that his family had learned the technique from German immigrants in the 19th century, Hiroshi's face lit up with understanding. Through halting English, supplemented by gestures and drawings, Hiroshi explained that Japan had its own frozen desserts, though they were quite different from American ice cream. He described kakigori, shaved ice flavored with sweet syrups, and how it was sold by street vendors during hot summer festivals. The conversation that followed was animated and joyful as guards and prisoners compared their different approaches to beating the heat and celebrating simple pleasures. Jimmy seized the opportunity to suggest a practical demonstration. With Major Thompson's permission, he proposed that the next cultural exchange event could include a hands-on ice cream making session, where American soldiers could teach the traditional churning method while prisoners shared their knowledge of Japanese frozen treats. The idea was met with enthusiasm from both sides, and plans began immediately for what would become known as the Ice Cream Diplomacy Program. Over the following weeks, the cultural exchange events became the highlight of camp life for participants on both sides. The ice cream making sessions were particularly successful, with prisoners and guards working together to operate the hand crank freezers while sharing stories and laughter. The physical act of taking turns at the churn created a natural rhythm for conversation, and the shared reward of fresh ice cream provided a perfect conclusion to each session. Hiroshi emerged as a natural bridge between the two groups, his command of English improving rapidly as he gained confidence in informal conversation. He began helping other prisoners communicate with the guards, and his translations often included cultural context that helped both sides understand not just what was being said, but why it mattered. Jimmy found himself looking forward to these sessions with an anticipation that surprised him. The success of the program began attracting attention from higher military authorities. Visiting officers came to observe the cultural exchanges, and reports were filed describing the improved morale and cooperation that had resulted from the new approach. Word spread to other prisoner-of-war camps throughout the Pacific, and several requested permission to implement similar programs. But the most significant change was in the daily atmosphere of the camp itself. The rigid separation between guards and prisoners had given way to a more relaxed environment where basic human courtesy was possible. Guards began learning simple Japanese phrases, while prisoners practiced their English during work details. The improvement in cooperation and communication made everyone's job easier and safer. Jimmy's role in initiating these changes had not gone unnoticed by his superiors. Major Thompson called him into his office one afternoon to discuss his future in the military. The major explained that the army was beginning to think seriously about post-war occupation duties in Japan, and that soldiers with experience in cross-cultural communication would be valuable assets in the challenging work of rebuilding a defeated nation. The conversation forced Jimmy to confront questions about his own future that he had been avoiding. The war was clearly ending, everyone could feel it in the air, and soon he would have to decide whether to return to civilian life in Kansas or pursue a military career that might take him to Japan as part of the occupation forces. The idea of continuing to work with Japanese people, of helping to build understanding between former enemies, appealed to him more than he had expected. Meanwhile, the prisoners were facing their own uncertain future. Rumors circulated constantly about when they might be repatriated, what kind of reception they would receive back home, and how their period of captivity would affect their standing in Japanese society. For many, the cultural exchange program had provided their first positive interaction with Americans, challenging their own preconceptions about their former enemies. Hiroshi confided to Jimmy during one of their conversations that he hoped to return to his university studies after the war, but that he now wanted to focus on international relations and cross-cultural understanding. The experience of captivity, particularly the unexpected kindness he had encountered, had convinced him that the future of Japan depended on building bridges with the outside world rather than maintaining the isolation that had characterized his country for so long. The ice cream making sessions had evolved into something more elaborate and meaningful. Prisoners began teaching guards about Japanese cooking techniques, while Americans shared recipes and cooking methods from their own diverse backgrounds. The mess hall became a laboratory for cultural fusion, where East met West over shared meals and mutual curiosity about different ways of life. One particularly memorable evening, the group attempted to create a fusion dessert that combined American ice cream with Japanese flavoring techniques. The result was a green tea ice cream that none of them had ever tasted before, but which somehow perfectly represented the spirit of cooperation and innovation that had come to define their interactions. The success of the experiment led to more ambitious culinary adventures and deeper conversations about the differences and similarities between their cultures. As summer turned toward autumn, news arrived that would change everything once again. The atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan had announced its surrender. The war was officially over, and the prisoners would soon be going home. The news brought a mixture of relief and sadness to the camp. Relief that the killing was finally finished, but sadness that the unique community they had built would soon be scattered to the winds. The final cultural exchange event was held as a farewell celebration, with both guards and prisoners contributing to a feast that showcased the culinary fusion they had developed together. Speeches were made in both languages, with Hiroshi serving as translator for the Japanese prisoners who wanted to express their gratitude for the unexpected kindness they had received. Jimmy found himself struggling with emotions he couldn't quite name, as he realized that these men whom he had been taught to hate had become something approaching friends. The preparations for repatriation began immediately, with prisoners gathering their few possessions and guards processing the paperwork that would send them home to an uncertain future in a defeated nation. The ice cream making equipment was packed away. The cultural exchange program officially ended, and the camp began returning to the purely functional military facility it had been designed to be. But the relationships that had been forged over bowls of ice cream and shared stories would not be so easily dissolved. The morning of departure arrived with a crisp autumn breeze that carried the salt smell of the ocean and the promise of change. Jimmy stood at his guard post, watching as the Japanese prisoners gathered their meager belongings and prepared for the journey home. The scene was both joyful and heartbreaking. Joyful because these men would finally see their families again. Heartbreaking because the unique community they had built together was about to be scattered across the Pacific. Hiroshi approached the fence where Jimmy was stationed, carrying a small package wrapped in cloth. Through the interpreter, he explained that he had made something for Jimmy as a farewell gift. Inside the cloth was an origami crane, folded with extraordinary precision from a piece of paper he had somehow acquired. The interpreter explained that in Japanese culture, the crane symbolized peace and good fortune, and that Hiroshi hoped Jimmy would remember their friendship whenever he looked at it. In return, Jimmy had prepared his own gift, a handwritten copy of his grandmother's ice cream recipe, complete with detailed instructions and notes about variations he had learned from other soldiers during their cultural exchange sessions. He had also included a small American flag pin that his mother had sent him, explaining through the interpreter that he wanted Hiroshi to have something that represented the best of American values, the ideals of freedom, friendship, and hope that had allowed their unlikely bond to flourish. The exchange of gifts was witnessed by other prisoners and guards, many of whom had formed their own connections during the cultural exchange program. Similar scenes were playing out throughout the compound as men who had been enemies just months before said goodbye as friends. The transformation was remarkable and would have been unthinkable when Jimmy first arrived at the camp. Major Thompson addressed both groups in a brief ceremony, speaking about the importance of the relationships that had been built and the hope that these connections might contribute to lasting peace between their nations. He announced that the cultural exchange program would be documented and recommended for implementation at other facilities, ensuring that the lessons learned here would not be forgotten. The trucks arrived at noon to transport the prisoners to the port where they would board ships for Japan. As the men climbed aboard, Jimmy felt a profound sense of loss that surprised him with its intensity. These were supposed to be his enemies, yet he found himself genuinely sad to see them go. The ice cream incident that had started it all seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been only a few months since that first moment of cultural shock and recognition. Hiroshi was among the last to board, and he paused to look back at Jimmy one final time. The two young men nodded to each other across the distance, a gesture that carried the weight of everything they had shared and learned together. Then the truck pulled away, carrying Hiroshi toward an uncertain future in a defeated and devastated homeland. The weeks that followed were strangely empty for Jimmy. The camp continued to function, but without the prisoners, it felt hollow and purposeless. The cultural exchange program had given meaning to his service that went beyond simple guard duty, and its absence left him questioning what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. The offer to join the occupation forces in Japan became increasingly attractive as he contemplated his options. Letters from home painted a picture of a nation celebrating victory and eager to return to peacetime normalcy. His mother wrote about the celebrations in Topeka, the boys coming home, and the plans for rebuilding and moving forward. But Jimmy found it difficult to share in the simple joy of victory. His experience with the Japanese prisoners had complicated his understanding of the war and its aftermath in ways that were hard to explain to people who hadn't been there. The decision to volunteer for occupation duty in Japan was not an easy one, but it felt inevitable. Jimmy wanted to continue the work that had begun with a bowl of ice cream, the work of building understanding between former enemies and helping to create a foundation for lasting peace. His family didn't understand the choice, but they supported it, trusting that their son knew what was best for his own future. The journey to Japan took Jimmy across the same Pacific waters that had carried Hiroshi and the other prisoners home months earlier. As the ship approached the Japanese coast, Jimmy found himself wondering what he would find there. The reports from the occupation forces described a nation devastated by bombing, struggling with hunger and defeat, trying to rebuild from the ashes of total war. Tokyo in the winter of 1946 was a city of contrasts. Ancient temples standing amid rubble from bombing raids, American soldiers distributing food to hungry civilians, and everywhere the quiet dignity of a people trying to maintain their cultural identity while adapting to occupation and defeat. Jimmy's assignment was to work with civilian authorities on reconstruction projects, but his real mission, as he saw it, was to continue building the bridges of understanding that had begun in the prisoner camp. The reunion with Hiroshi came about through a combination of determination and luck. Jimmy had kept the address that Hiroshi had given him during their farewell, and after weeks of navigating the bureaucracy of occupied Japan, he finally managed to locate his former prisoner in a small apartment near the ruins of Tokyo Imperial University. The moment of recognition was electric. Two young men who had found friendship across the vast divide of war, now meeting again in a world transformed by peace. Hiroshi had indeed returned to his studies, though the university was still rebuilding from wartime damage. He was working on a thesis about American literature and its influence on Japanese writers, a project that had been inspired partly by his conversations with Jimmy and other American soldiers during captivity. The irony was not lost on either of them. The prisoner of war camp had become an unexpected classroom for cross-cultural education. The friendship that resumed in post-war Tokyo was different from what they had shared in the camp, but it was no less meaningful. Jimmy helped Hiroshi practice his English while learning basic Japanese in return. They explored the city together, with Hiroshi serving as guide to the cultural treasures that had survived the war, while Jimmy shared his perspective on the American occupation and its goals for Japanese reconstruction. The ice cream shop that Hiroshi eventually opened was located in the Shibuya district, in a small space that had been rebuilt from the rubble of a building destroyed in the bombing raids. The shop's name, written in both Japanese and English, was Peace Cream, a reference to the origami crane and the friendship that had inspired its creation. The shop became a gathering place for Japanese civilians and American occupation personnel, a small symbol of the reconciliation that was slowly taking place across the broader society. Jimmy's role in helping to establish the shop went beyond simple friendship. He used his connections with American suppliers to obtain equipment and ingredients that were still difficult to find in post-war Japan. More importantly, he helped Hiroshi navigate the complex regulations and cultural expectations that governed interactions between Japanese civilians and American occupation forces. The shop became a model for the kind of cooperation and mutual respect that both men hoped would characterize the new relationship between their countries. The success of Peace Cream attracted attention from both Japanese and American media, who saw in it a heartwarming story of former enemies becoming friends and business partners. Articles appeared in newspapers on both sides of the Pacific, describing how a simple bowl of ice cream had planted the seeds of understanding that had grown into lasting friendship and successful cooperation. Years later, as Jimmy prepared to return to the United States to start his own family and career, he reflected on the journey that had begun with that first moment of cultural shock in the prisoner camp. The ice cream incident had opened his eyes to the humanity of his supposed enemies, leading to friendships that had enriched his life and shaped his understanding of the world. The lesson was simple but profound, that even in the darkest moments of conflict and hatred, small acts of kindness and curiosity could build bridges of understanding that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. The final scene of this remarkable story took place at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, where Jimmy and Hiroshi said goodbye once again, this time with the knowledge that their friendship would continue across the Pacific through letters, visits, and the shared memory of how a bowl of ice cream had changed both their lives. As Jimmy's plane lifted off for the journey home, he carried with him the origami crane that Hiroshi had given him years earlier, now faded, but still carefully preserved as a reminder of the power of human connection to overcome even the deepest divisions. The legacy of their friendship extended far beyond their personal relationship. The cultural exchange program that had grown from Jimmy's simple act of sharing ice cream became a model for prisoner treatment that influenced military policy for decades to come. More importantly, it demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, the fundamental human capacity for empathy, curiosity, and friendship could survive and flourish, offering hope for a more peaceful and understanding world. Sometimes, as this story shows us, the most profound changes begin with the smallest gestures. A bowl of ice cream shared between former enemies became the foundation for a friendship that helped heal the wounds of war and build bridges of understanding between two very different cultures. In our own time, when divisions seem deep and understanding feels impossible, we might remember that peace often begins not with grand gestures or formal treaties, but with simple acts of human kindness that recognize our shared humanity across all the barriers that seem to separate us.